$600 million gone. That's what the Iranian people lost when the British government tore up a contract in 1951. Not lost to war, not lost to nature, stolen in broad daylight with lawyers. But rewind the tape, because 5 years earlier, nobody saw it coming. Tehran, 1946. The Shah sits in Golestan Palace, 26 years old, draped in silk that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. French champagne in crystal, British advisors in the garden, American jazz on the gramophone. The oil flows, 16 million barrels a year, pulled from Abadan, the largest refinery on earth. You could smell it from 5 miles out. Crude and money, mixed together, baking under the Persian sun. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company ran the operation. British firm, British managers, British profits. They paid the Iranian government a royalty, 16%. The rest, London. The Iranians pumped the oil. The British named the price. It was a rig. Everyone knew it. Nobody said it out loud. Here's what stability looked like in 1946. The AIOC headquarters in Tehran. Marble floors, polished daily by Iranian workers who earned less than £1 a week. The British executives? They lived in Khorramshahr, a company town with swimming pools, tennis courts, and imported beef. Separate hospitals, separate schools. The Iranians called it the colony. The company books showed profit margins of 200%. The Iranian treasury got crumbs. But the Shah needed the British. He needed their recognition, their weapons, their seat at the table. So he smiled. He signed. He cashed the checks. The oil kept flowing. And in London, the British Empire was bleeding. World War II had drained the vaults. India was slipping away. The pound was collapsing, but there was one asset that still printed money: Iranian oil. The British economy ran on it, literally. 40% of the Royal Navy's fuel came from Abadan. The refineries kept the lights on in Liverpool and Manchester. So when the Iranians started asking questions, why do we only get 16%? Why are your accountants the only ones who see the books? The answer was always the same. The contract is the contract. Signed in 1933. 60 years, non-negotiable. But here's the thing about contracts written by empires. They only work when you've got the guns to enforce them. And by 1949, Britain didn't. The crack appeared in the Iranian parliament. The Majles, a lawyer named Mohammad Mossadegh, stood up and did the math in public. He held up the AIOC financial reports, numbers the British thought no one would read, and he showed the room what 16% actually meant. The company had made £200 million in profit the previous year. Iran received £16 million. The British government, through taxes on AIOC, they took in more than the Iranians did. They pay His Majesty's Treasury more than they pay us, Mossadegh said, for our oil, from our ground. The chamber went silent. Someone asked, "What if we renegotiate?" The British ambassador sent a cable to London. One line: situation manageable. They lack the technical expertise to operate the fields alone. Classic miscalculation, because across the Middle East, other countries were watching. Saudi Arabia had just renegotiated with Aramco, 50-50 split. Venezuela had done the same. Even the Kuwaitis were asking questions. Iran was the oldest oil producer in the region, the most educated workforce, the most refined infrastructure, and they were getting 16%. Winter 1950, the AICO sent a delegation to Tehran. Offer on the table. Increase the royalty to 20%. Final offer. Take it or leave it. The Iranians countered 50-50, like the Saudis. The British laughed, actually laughed. One executive was quoted in the Times. The Iranians lack the sophistication to understand modern contracts. That quote made the front page of every newspaper in Tehran. Mossadegh read it aloud in Parliament. Then he said 6 words that changed everything. Then we will take it back. Nationalization. The word spread through Tehran like a fever. Students painted it on walls. Workers chanted it in the oil fields. Shopkeepers debated it over tea. The British dismissed it. Political theatre, the Foreign Office called it. They'll never vote for it. But the pressure was building, not just in Parliament, in the streets. Because here's what the average Iranian saw. British managers in Abadan earned 10 times what Iranian engineers made. The company hospital treated British families first. When an Iranian worker died in an accident, and they did, regularly, the AIOC paid the family less compensation than they'd pay for damaged equipment. The oil was making Britain rich. It was keeping Iran poor, and everyone knew it. March 15th, 1951. The Marjals convened. Emergency session. The vote. Nationalize the oil industry. Seize the assets. Kick out the AIOC. Mossadegh stood at the podium. He'd prepared for this moment for years. He had the legal briefs. He had international law on his side. He had the numbers. He had one question. Who owns the oil beneath our feet? The vote passed. 79-12. 4 days later, the Shah appointed Mossadegh Prime Minister. And in London, in a wood-panelled office in Whitehall, a British official read the telegram and said to his colleague, "They've just made the worst mistake of their lives." He was wrong. The worst mistake was thinking the Iranians would back down. For 48 hours, it seemed like a bluff. The British waited for the Iranians to realize they couldn't run the refinery alone. They waited for the panic, the backtracking, the apology. Instead, Mossadegh sent engineers to Abadan with eviction notices. And the British? They sent warships. May 1951. HMS Mauritius drops anchor off Abadan, a cruiser. 8 6-inch guns, 1,200 tons of steel floating in the Shat al-Arab waterway. The message was clear. Touch the refinery and we sink your ports. But here's what the British didn't advertise. The ship's fuel tanks were half empty. The Royal Navy was rationing diesel. The empire that once ruled the waves was now checking the gauge before leaving harbour. Mossadegh saw the ship. He sent a telegram to London anyway. The nationalisation stands. Your property is now ours. Evacuate your personnel. Britain had 2 options. Negotiate a dignified exit or fight a war they couldn't afford. They chose option 3, suffocate Iran slowly. The blockade started soft. No guns, no invasion, just paperwork. The British government announced that any oil leaving Iran was stolen property. Any ship that loaded Iranian crude would be impounded. Any company that bought it would face lawsuits in British courts. Lloyd's of London, the shipping insurer, refused to cover tankers going to Abadan. No insurance, no shipping, no buyers. The Italians tried anyway. Sent a tanker called the Rosemary to load Iranian oil. The British Navy intercepted it in the Suez Canal, arrested the captain, seized the cargo. After that, no one touched Iranian oil. Inside Abadan, the Iranians kept the refinery running, barely. The British engineers had left in April, packed their tennis rackets, locked the technical manuals in safes, and flew to London. They assumed the Iranians couldn't operate the equipment alone. They were almost right. The refinery was a beast. Built in 1913, expanded every decade since. Miles of pipes, hundreds of valves, cracking towers 12 stories tall. The British had designed it so only British engineers understood it, but the Iranians had been watching for decades. The workers, who the British thought were just turning wrenches, some of them had engineering degrees from European universities. They'd been locked out of management jobs because of their passports, not their competence. One engineer, Ahmad Aramesh, had worked at Abadan for 22 years, never promoted past floor supervisor. Now he was running the control room. He kept the flames burning, kept the crude flowing into the distillation towers, kept the gasoline separating from the diesel. For 6 months, It worked. Then the storage tanks filled up. 16 million barrels of refined oil, sitting in tanks under the Iranian sun. No buyers, no ships, no cash. Mossadegh tried selling to smaller countries. Pakistan said no, too scared of Britain. India said no, still part of the Commonwealth. Even the Soviets passed. Stalin wanted leverage, not oil. The Iranian economy started coughing. Government salaries went unpaid. Infrastructure projects froze. The currency dropped 20% in 3 months. And in London, the British watched the pressure build. But here's the thing the British miscalculated. They assumed economic pain would break the Iranians politically. Instead, it unified them. The bazaar merchants, the clerics, the students, the union workers, they all rallied behind Mossadegh, not because they loved him, because they hated being humiliated. Every time a British official called Iran incapable of self-management, it made the front page in Tehran. Every time the Royal Navy stopped a tanker, crowds gathered in the streets, chanting, Marg bar Engelis, death to England. This wasn't about oil anymore. It was about dignity. And Mossadegh understood that. He played it perfectly. He held rallies in front of the Majles. He wore simple clothes, no European suits, no French cologne, just an Iranian man in Iranian fabric, talking about Iranian rights. He went on national radio and said, "They think we will beg. Let me be clear. We will drink rainwater and eat bread before we surrender our sovereignty." The crowd outside the Parliament building went wild. Back in London, the cabinet was panicking, not because of Iran, because of the precedent. Egypt was watching. Iraq was watching. Nigeria, Kuwait, Libya, every country with British oil contracts was taking notes. If Iran got away with nationalization, the entire imperial oil system would collapse. Billions of pounds gone. The British Foreign Secretary, Herbert Morrison, said it in a closed meeting. If we let the Persians steal our oil, every colony with a hole in the ground will try the same thing. So the British escalated. They went to the United Nations, accused Iran of theft, demanded international sanctions. Mossadegh flew to New York himself, October 1951, stood in front of the Security Council in a suit that had seen better days and argued his case. He was brilliant. He quoted British trade records showing that AIOC had made over £1 billion in profit since 1933. He showed how Iran had received less than 10% of that. He cited international law. He referenced the US oil deals with Saudi Arabia, 50-50 splits that Britain itself had acknowledged as fair. Then he said, "Britain calls this theft. I call it repossession. You cannot steal what already belongs to you." The room was silent. The vote came. Britain lost. The UN refused to sanction Iran. Mossadegh flew back to Tehran in triumph. Crowds lined the streets, from the airport to the city center. 1 million people chanting his name. And in Washington, President Truman sent a private message to Churchill. "The Iranians have a point. Maybe it's time to negotiate." Churchill's reply was 3 words: absolutely not. Because Britain had one card left to play, and it wasn't legal. Winter 1952. The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, opened a file, codename Operation Boot. The objective: remove Mossadegh from power by any means necessary. They'd done it before. In Egypt, in Burma, in 6 colonies that got too independent. The playbook was simple. Find the military officers who felt overlooked. Fund the opposition newspapers. Spread rumors about communism. Stage protests. Create chaos. Then wait for the government to collapse under its own weight. The British had the experience. They had the contacts in Tehran. They had the money. There was just one problem. They didn't have enough money. The empire was broke. The pound was in freefall. The Korean War was draining the budget. Britain couldn't afford a coup, So they made a phone call to Washington, to the CIA. Here's what the British pitch sounded like. Mossadegh is a communist sympathizer. He's nationalizing industry. He's destabilizing the region. If Iran falls to the Soviets, the entire Middle East goes red. Every word was a lie. Mossadegh hated the communists. He'd banned the Tudeh party from his coalition. He was a nationalist, not a Marxist. But it was 1952. The Red Scare was at fever pitch in America. The CIA saw communists in every shadow. And here was Britain, offering them a chance to stop a Soviet takeover in the Middle East. All they needed to do was help remove one troublesome prime minister. The CIA director, Walter Bedell Smith, read the file. Then he asked, "How much?" Britain said, $1 million. We'll handle the rest. The CIA said, done. Back in Tehran, Mossadegh had no idea. He was too busy trying to keep the lights on. The oil money was gone. The reserves were empty. He'd started printing currency just to pay civil servants. Inflation hit 30%. Bread prices doubled. The bazaar started grumbling. And in the palace, the Shah was getting nervous. He'd supported nationalization at first. It was popular, and he needed popularity. But now the economy was collapsing. The military was restless. The Americans were whispering in his ear, "Mossadegh is losing control. You need to act before the communists do." The Shah was 22 years old, weak, indecisive, terrified of his own shadow. But he had one thing Mossadegh didn't: a direct line to the CIA station chief. June 1953. Mossadegh made his fatal mistake. He asked for emergency powers, temporary, 6 months, just to stabilize the economy and restructure the government. The Majles debated it. The clerics protested it. Even his allies questioned it. But it passed, barely. And the moment it did, the British propaganda machine went into overdrive. Every newspaper they funded in Tehran ran the same headline: Mossadegh becomes dictator. The CIA printed pamphlets, paid protesters, bribed journalists. They spread rumors. Mossadegh was selling the country to the Soviets. He was going to seize private property next. He was planning mass arrests. None of it was true. All of it worked. August 15th, 1953. The Shah signed the order, Decree 967. It stripped Mossadegh of his emergency powers and appointed General Fazlollah Zahedi as the new prime minister. Constitutional? Debatable. Legal? Barely. But the Shah had the document. He had the signature. He had CIA approval. All he needed now was the courage to deliver it. He sent a colonel to Mossadegh's house at 1 a.m. with the decree. Mossadegh read it. Then he did something no one expected. He refused to resign. He called the palace. He called his supporters. He called the radio station. By dawn, crowds were surrounding his house. Soldiers loyal to Mossadegh blocked the streets. The Shah's colonel was arrested. The coup had failed. And the Shah? He ran, packed a suitcase, flew to Baghdad. Then Rome. The monarchy had just collapsed. For 72 hours, Iran had no king. But the CIA wasn't done, because the first coup was just the rehearsal. August 16th, 1953, the Shah's plane touches down in Rome. He checks into the Excelsior Hotel under a fake name, watches Italian game shows on a black and white television, smokes cigarettes, waits for the phone to ring. In Tehran, Mossadegh addresses the nation. His voice crackles over the radio. The people have defeated tyranny. Iran will remain free. Crowds flood the streets. They tear down statues of the Shah's father. They burn British flags. Students spray paint "Long live democracy" on government buildings. For 3 days, it looks like the Iranian people won. Then the CIA made a phone call. Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, CIA operative, 37 years old, currently sitting in the basement of the US Embassy in Tehran with a briefcase full of cash. $1 million in reals, stacked in bundles. Roosevelt had one job: finish what the Shah started. He'd been in Tehran for 6 weeks, setting up networks, bribing newspaper editors, recruiting thugs, mapping out which military officers could be bought and which ones needed threats. The first coup failed because it was top-down. The Shah's signature, a midnight decree. Too clean, too obvious. The second coup would come from the streets, and it would look like chaos. August 17th, 1953. Morning. Trucks roll into South Tehran, not military trucks. Civilian, loaded with men. Laborers, dock workers, wrestlers from the Zirconieh gyms, paid $10 each, cash up front. They carried clubs, knives, Iranian flags. The CIA handlers told them, go to Mossadegh's house, chant for the Shah, start fights, make it loud. But here's the twist. Roosevelt also paid a second group, communist agitators from the two-day party. He gave them money to march for Mossadegh, to wave Soviet flags, to shout Marxist slogans. 2 mobs, both funded by the CIA, both headed for a collision. By noon, Tehran was a war zone. The first punch was thrown outside the Majals. A 2-day member waving a red flag got clubbed by a royalist. Then a royalist got stabbed. Then the police tried to separate them and got overwhelmed. Shops locked their doors. Cars flipped. Fire spread from a newsstand into a market. The radio stations, CIA funded, reported it as communist uprising in Tehran. Mossadegh losing control. None of it was organic. All of it was choreographed. And the Iranian army, watching from their barracks, saw exactly what Roosevelt wanted them to see: anarchy. General Fazlollah Zahedi had been waiting for this moment. He'd been in hiding since the first coup failed, locked in a CIA safe house, drinking tea, smoking cigars, waiting for the signal. Roosevelt sent a messenger. One sentence: the city is ready. Move now. Zahedi put on his uniform, loaded into a convoy of jeeps, drove to the radio station with 300 soldiers. No resistance. The guards had been paid to leave their posts. Zahedi walked into the broadcast booth, adjusted the microphone, and spoke to the nation. Citizens of Iran, I am your Prime Minister. By order of His Imperial Majesty, the traitor Mossadegh has been removed. The monarchy is restored. Martial law is in effect. Return to your homes. Then he sent tanks to Mossadegh's house. Mossadegh heard the broadcast. He looked out the window, saw the crowds scattering, saw the smoke rising, heard the rumble of tank treads on asphalt. He had 2 options: fight or surrender. His guards wanted to fight, barricade the house, turn it into a fortress, die like martyrs. Mossadegh said no. He'd seen what happened when leaders turned their homes into battlefields. Blood in the streets. Civilians caught in crossfire. The narrative twisted into Mossadegh caused a civil war. He walked out the back door, climbed a fence, hid in a neighbor's basement. The tanks rolled up. Soldiers stormed the house, found it empty. On the radio, Zahedi declared victory. August 19th, 1953. Mossadegh turned himself in, walked into a police station wearing pajamas, said, I don't want more Iranians to die for me. They arrested him, threw him in a military prison, charged him with treason. The trial was a spectacle. The judge was appointed by Zahedi. The witnesses were paid actors. The evidence was fabricated. Mossadegh defended himself, argued for 3 days, quoted Iranian law, international law, the UN Charter. The judge cut him off. You are guilty of conspiring against the monarchy. Sentence: 3 years in prison, then house arrest for life. Mossadegh was 61 years old, He had spent the next 14 years locked in his own home, forbidden from speaking to journalists, forbidden from leaving his village. He died in 1967, in bed, alone, erased from Iranian history books. The Shah flew back from Rome, landed in Tehran to cheering crowds, paid crowds, organized by the CIA, but the cameras didn't show that. He drove through the city in an open-top car, waved to the people, acted like he'd won a revolution instead of buying one. In his first speech, he thanked God, the army, and the loyal citizens who stood against communism. He didn't thank the CIA, not in public, but in private. He met with Kermit Roosevelt in the palace, shook his hand, said, "I owe you my throne." Roosevelt smiled, said, "You owe us more than that, because here's what the coup actually cost. $1 million in cash. That's what the CIA spent. Bribes, propaganda, hired thugs, all of it for less than the price of a single fighter jet. But the return on investment, incalculable. The oil was back in play. Within a month, the new government started negotiations, not with the British, with an international consortium. Britain still wanted full control of the oil. The Americans said no. That's what started this mess. We're doing it differently. The New Deal split the oil rights, 40% to Britain, through the renamed British Petroleum, 40% to American companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, Gulf, 14% to Royal Dutch Shell, 6% to a French company. Iran got 50% of the profits. On paper. In practice, the consortium controlled the pricing, the production levels, the export routes. They kept the books. They hired the auditors. They decided what profit meant. Iran got a cut, but the British and Americans got the control. And the refinery at Abadan, it kept running under new management, with the same workers, pumping the same oil. The only thing that changed was who signed the checks. Back in London, Churchill addressed Parliament. October 1953. He didn't mention the coup, didn't mention Roosevelt, didn't mention the $1 million, or the fake protests, or the paid mobs. He said, "The Iranian oil crisis has been resolved through diplomacy and the restoration of lawful government. British interests in the region are secure." Applause. Standing ovation. Nobody asked how the lawful government got restored. Nobody asked why Mossadegh was in prison. Nobody asked who funded the tanks. Because the oil was flowing again, and that's all that mattered. But here's the thing about coups. They don't end when the tanks leave. They metastasize. The Shah, propped up by foreign powers, knew he was illegitimate. So he built a police state to stay in power. The Savak, secret police, trained by the CIA and Mossad, torture chambers in Tehran, disappearances, censorship, paranoia. Every journalist who questioned the Shah got arrested. Every student who protested got beaten. Every cleric who called for justice got exiled. For 25 years, the Shah ruled Iran like a man who knew his throne was rented, not owned. And the Iranian people, they remembered. They remembered Mossadegh. They remembered the coup. They remembered who put the Shah back in power. Britain. America. The West. They remembered that when Iran tried to control its own resources, the empire sent warships. When Iran elected a leader who said no to foreign domination, the CIA sent cash and thugs. They remembered that democracy lasted 72 hours before it was crushed by foreign money. 1979, the revolution came. Not communist, not secular, Islamic, led by an exiled cleric named Khomeini who'd been living in Paris, watching, waiting, planning. The Shah fled again, this time for good. Died in exile. Cancer. Egypt. 1980. The revolutionaries stormed the US embassy, took hostages, held them for 444 days, chanted "Death to America" in the streets. American media called it fanaticism. irrationality, religious extremism. But ask any Iranian over 50 why they stormed that embassy, and they'll tell you the same thing. Because in 1953, the Americans stole our future. The oil kept flowing through wars, sanctions, revolutions. It always does. British Petroleum, formerly the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, became one of the largest corporations on earth. Market cap, $100 billion. Iran got a revolution. Britain got BP. And Mossadegh, he got erased. His name disappeared from textbooks. His speeches were banned. His grave was unmarked for decades. Because the empire doesn't just take your oil, it takes your history too. But here's the question nobody asked in 1953. What if Iran had been allowed to keep its oil? What if Mossadegh had finished his term? What if the democracy had survived? Would there have been a revolution in 1979? Would there be US sanctions today? Would Iran be an enemy or an ally? We'll never know, because on August 19th, 1953, the CIA and MI6 made a choice. They chose oil over democracy, profit over principle, control over sovereignty. And they got away with it for 25 years, until the bill came due November 4th, 1979, 6:30 in the morning. The US Embassy in Tehran, a compound the size of 27 acres, walls topped with barbed wire, Marine guards at the gate. Then the chanting started. 3,000 students, packed shoulder to shoulder outside the walls, some holding pictures of Khomeini, others holding wire cutters. They'd been planning this for weeks, mapping the entrances, timing the shift changes, waiting for the right moment. The moment came. They cut the chains, poured through the gates, overwhelmed the Marines, who had orders not to shoot. 66 Americans captured, blindfolded, paraded in front of cameras. The students searched the embassy, found filing cabinets full of CIA documents, names of informants, payment records, communication cables. And there it was, in black and white, declassified proof of the 1953 coup. Roosevelt's expense reports, lists of bribed journalists, maps of safe houses. The students held up the papers on state television. Read them aloud. This is what they did to us. This is why we're here. The hostages would stay captive for 444 days, but the documents, those would haunt American foreign policy forever. Rewind 26 years. Because the path from the coup to the hostage crisis wasn't a straight line. It was a slow burn. 1953 to 1979. The Shah's reign, backed by American money, armed by American weapons, protected by American intelligence. On paper, Iran became a success story. GDP growth, infrastructure projects, universities, the White Revolution, land reform, women's suffrage, literacy campaigns. Western media called the Shah a modernizer. Time magazine put him on the cover twice. Nixon called him a pillar of stability in the Middle East. But here's what the cameras didn't show. The Savak headquarters in Tehran, basement cells, electrodes, waterboarding. People disappeared into that building and came out broken, if they came out at all. Amnesty International estimated 25,000 political prisoners by 1975. Torture was systematic. Confessions were extracted with pliers and electrical cables. The Shah called it security. The Iranians called it terror. And the oil money? It flowed, but not to the people. The consortium deal from 1954 gave Iran 50% of the profits. Sounds fair, except the companies controlled the definitions. They decided what crude oil cost. They decided what refining cost. They decided what operating expenses meant. They kept 3 sets of books, one for Iran, one for taxes, one for themselves. In 1973, OPEC raised oil prices. Global price per barrel went from $3 to $12. Iranian revenue should have quadrupled. It didn't. The consortium renegotiated. They claimed extraordinary market conditions allowed them to recalculate their costs. Iran's share increased, but not proportionally. The companies took the windfall. The Shah didn't fight it, because he needed American weapons more than he needed a fair contract. He was buying F-14 Tomcats, M60 tanks, Hawk missiles, billions of dollars in arms deals, turning Iran into a regional military power. But the people? They were still living in villages without electricity, working in factories for $2 a day, watching the Shah build palaces while their children went hungry. The breaking point came in 1977. President Carter visited Tehran, toasted the Shah at a state dinner, called Iran an island of stability in a turbulent region. That speech aired on Iranian television. The next day, students at Tehran University walked out. They didn't shout. They didn't riot. They just walked. Silent protest. Within a week, 10,000 students joined them. Then, 20,000. Then, the bazaar merchants closed their shops. Then, the oil workers went on strike. The Shah panicked, sent in the Savak. Arrests, beatings, bullets. January 1978. A protest outside a mosque. Police opened fire. 70 dead, maybe more. The government said it was communist agitators. The clerics said it was martyrs. 40 days later, the traditional mourning period. Another protest. This time in Tabriz. More dead. 40 days after that, another city. More bodies. The cycle repeated. Funeral. Protest. Massacre. Funeral. By September 1978, the streets of Tehran looked like a war zone. The Shah tried everything. He fired his prime minister, appointed a military government, imposed martial law, banned gatherings of more than 3 people. September 8th, 1978. Black Friday. A crowd gathered in Jaleh Square despite the curfew. 15,000 people, unarmed, chanting, "Death to the Shah." The Imperial Guard opened fire, machine guns, live rounds into the crowd. The official death toll, 87. Unofficial, closer to 400. The next day, the oil workers walked off the job. All of them, every refinery, every pipeline, every pump. Iranian oil production dropped from 6 million barrels a day to 1 million, then to 0. The Shah's lifeline was severed. But here's the thing. The Americans still thought they could save him. Carter sent advisors. The CIA sent intelligence. The Pentagon drew up contingency plans for a military intervention. But on the ground, the revolution was unstoppable. Because it wasn't just students anymore. It wasn't just communists or clerics. It was everyone. The shopkeepers who remembered Mossadegh, the oil workers who remembered Abadan, the parents who remembered the coup, the grandparents who remembered when Iran owned its own resources. They weren't fighting for Islam. Not yet. They were fighting to erase 1953. December 1978. The Shah's last card was Ayatollah Khomeini, the exiled cleric who'd been living in Iraq, then Paris, for 15 years, preaching, writing, organizing. The Shah thought Khomeini was fringe, old, irrelevant. He was wrong. Khomeini had spent 15 years building a network, smuggling cassette tapes of his sermons into Iran, turning mosques into command centers, framing the revolution in religious terms that resonated with millions. But the core message wasn't religious. It was political. The Shah is a puppet. The Americans are the puppet masters. We will cut the strings. Every speech mentioned 1953. Every tape referenced Mossadegh. Every sermon reminded Iranians that their democracy had been stolen by foreign powers. The revolution wasn't just against the Shah. It was against the coup that put him there. January 16th, 1979. The Shah left Iran, called it a vacation, packed 14 suitcases, flew to Egypt. He would never return. 2 weeks later, Khomeini landed in Tehran, February 1st, 1979. 2 million people lined the streets from the airport to the cemetery where the martyrs of Black Friday were buried. He gave one speech, 5 minutes, standing on a platform surrounded by microphones. The Shah is gone. The monarchy is dead. Iran is free. The crowd roared. 10 days later, the military declared neutrality. The police abandoned their posts. The revolutionaries seized the radio stations, the palaces, the prisons. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born. And the United States? They watched it collapse in real time. Carter's advisors debated intervention, send troops, launch airstrikes, restore order. But the Pentagon said no, too risky, too expensive, too late. So they did nothing. And then, 9 months later, the students stormed the embassy. The hostage crisis made global headlines for 444 days. Every night, American news anchors counted the days. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees. Carter's approval rating collapsed. But in Tehran, the crisis was about something else entirely. The students weren't asking for ransom. They were asking for acknowledgement. Admit what you did in 1953. Admit you overthrew our government. Admit you installed a dictator. Apologize. America refused, because admitting the coup meant admitting that Iran's grievances were legitimate, that the revolution wasn't irrational, that the hostages weren't victims of fanaticism. They were collateral damage in a 26-year-old crime. So the US stayed silent, and the hostages stayed captive. April 1980, Carter authorized a rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw. 8 helicopters, special forces, a plan to land in the desert, storm the embassy, extract the hostages. It failed before it started. 3 helicopters malfunctioned in a sandstorm. 1 crashed into a transport plane. 8 American soldiers died in the wreckage. The mission was aborted. When the news reached Tehran, Khomeini called it divine intervention. The Americans called it a disaster. Carter lost the election 6 months later. Reagan took office January 20th, 1981. The same day, literally the same hour, Iran released the hostages. Not because they feared Reagan, because they'd made their point. The oil never stopped flowing. That's the punchline. Through the revolution, the hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, the oil kept pumping. Iran nationalized it again in 1979. This time, no one stopped them. Not because the West suddenly respected sovereignty, because the revolution proved what Mossadegh had argued in 1951. Iran didn't need British engineers. They didn't need American managers. They could run the fields themselves. The consortium was gone. The contracts were void. Iran took full control. And British Petroleum, they pivoted, expanded into the North Sea, Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, lost Iran, gained everywhere else. By 1990, BP was bigger than it had ever been. The Iranian oil was a footnote in their annual reports, but the cost of the coup kept compounding. Iran became an enemy. Sanctions, isolation, decades of hostility. The Iran-Iraq war killed 500,000 people. Saddam Hussein, armed by the US, invaded Iran in 1980. The nuclear program, the proxy wars, Hezbollah, the chants of death to America that echo in Tehran to this day. All of it traces back to August 1953, because when you overthrow a democracy, you don't just change a government, you change a nation's relationship with the world. Iran could have been an ally, could have been a partner, could have been a democracy. Instead, it became a case study in blowback. London. The British government released declassified documents, 30,000 pages, proof of MI6's role in the coup. Names, payments, plans. A Foreign Office memo from 1953. The removal of Mossadegh is a matter of British survival. Use all means necessary. The files confirmed what Iranians had known for 50 years. The coup was real. It was planned. It was executed by foreign intelligence. Britain never apologized. Washington. The CIA finally admitted it. 60 years late. A press release buried on a Friday afternoon. The CIA played a role in the 1953 coup in Iran. No apology, no accountability, just acknowledgement. By then, 2 generations of Iranians had grown up hating America for something their government refused to admit. Mossadegh's house still stands. Outside Tehran, a museum now. Photographs on the walls. His books on the shelves. His pajamas in a glass case. The ones he wore when he surrendered in 1953. Every year, thousands of Iranians visit. Students, families, old men who remember. They stand in front of his grave, finally marked after the revolution, and they ask the same question. What if he'd been allowed to finish? What if democracy had survived? What if Iran had kept its oil in 1951 instead of 1979? We'll never know, because the empire doesn't let go quietly, and the cost of holding on, paid in full by both sides. For 70 years and counting, a barrel of Iranian oil sits in a tanker off the coast of China, black, dense, worth $80 on the global market. Iran pumps 3 million barrels a day, has been for years, despite sanctions, despite isolation, despite 70 years of the West trying to control who gets to sell it. The oil that Britain said Iran couldn't manage, Iran's been managing it just fine. But here's the thing about theft. The stolen goods eventually lose value compared to what was actually taken. Britain didn't just steal oil in 1953. They stole trust, stole sovereignty, stole the possibility of what Iran could have become. And that cost, still being paid. Let's do the math. 1951 to 1953. 2 years of nationalized oil. Iran produced roughly 30 million barrels, sold almost none of it because of the British blockade. Estimated loss, $600 million in 1953 money, about $6 billion in today's terms. That's the number everyone quotes. The immediate theft. But the real theft was bigger, much bigger. 1954 to 1979. The consortium years, Iran got 50% of the profits. On paper. In reality, the oil companies controlled pricing, production levels, and accounting. A 1974 US Senate investigation found that American oil companies operating in Iran had been underreporting profits by an average of 23%. They called it creative accounting. The Iranians called it fraud. Over 25 years, Iran lost an estimated $40 billion in underpaid royalties. 40 billion with a B. That's hospitals, universities, infrastructure, an entire generation's worth of development. Gone, siphoned into Western bank accounts. But even that's not the real cost. The real cost was the Shah. 26 years of dictatorship. Propped up by the coup, funded by oil money, armed by America, protected by Savak torture chambers. The human toll, 25,000 political prisoners, thousands executed, tens of thousands tortured, an entire generation traumatized. The economic toll, the Shah spent $60 billion on weapons between 1970 and 1978. 60 billion on tanks and fighter jets and missiles. Meanwhile, Iranian infant mortality was higher than Turkey's. Literacy rates were lower than Egypt's. 30% of the population had no access to clean water. The oil money went to generals and arms dealers, not to the people who pumped it. 1980 to 88. The Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, backed by the United States, armed by France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Chemical weapons, trench warfare, human wave attacks. 500,000 dead, maybe more. Nobody counted accurately. Why did Saddam invade? Because he saw a revolution in chaos and thought he could seize the oil fields in Khuzestan, the same fields the British had controlled for 50 years. The war wouldn't have happened if the Shah was still in power. The Shah wouldn't have been in power without the coup. 500,000 lives traced back to 1953, 1995 present, the sanctions era. Iran tried to rebuild after the war, opened up to foreign investment, started negotiating with Western oil companies again. Then President Clinton signed an executive order, total embargo on Iran. No trade, no investment, no contact. Why? Because Iran was a state sponsor of terrorism, because they were developing a nuclear program, because they chanted death to America. But here's what Washington didn't say. Iran started developing nuclear technology in the 1970s, under the Shah, with American assistance. The revolutionary government inherited the program, continued it, and when the West accused them of building a bomb, Iran's response was simple. You spent 50 years controlling our oil. You think we'll trust you with our security? The sanctions cost Iran an estimated $200 billion in lost economic growth. $200 billion. And the nuclear program? Still running. Because when you spend 70 years proving you can't be trusted, people stop trusting you. But let's talk about what Britain actually got. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company became British Petroleum, BP, one of the 7 largest oil companies on Earth. Revenue in 2003, $248 billion. Profit, $13 billion. Market cap at its peak, $239 billion. All of it built on the foundation of Iranian oil. The oil they said they discovered. The oil they said Iranians couldn't manage. The oil they staged a coup to keep. BP left Iran in 1979, but they kept the profits, kept the infrastructure knowledge, kept the drilling technology they'd developed in Abadan. They took that expertise to the North Sea, to Alaska, to the Gulf of Mexico, to Angola. Every offshore rig BP operates today traces its engineering lineage back to Abadan. The refinery the British said Iranians couldn't run. Iran lost 70 years of development. BP became a global empire. That's the transaction. And the British government, they got something too. Precedent. Because the 1953 coup wasn't the last time Britain and America overthrew a government to protect oil interests. It was the blueprint. 1954, Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz tried to nationalize land owned by United Fruit Company. CIA coup. Arbenz exiled. 40 years of military dictatorship followed. 1960, Congo. Patrice Lumumba tried to nationalize mining operations. Assassinated. Mobutu installed. 32 years of kleptocracy. 1973, Chile. Salvador Allende tried to nationalize copper mines. CIA-backed coup. Pinochet dictatorship. Thousands disappeared. The playbook from Iran worked, so they kept using it. Fund the opposition, spread rumors about communism, bribe the military, stage the chaos, install a puppet, repeat. But here's the thing about blowback. It's never just one explosion. Iran's 1979 revolution inspired Islamic movements across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Not because Khomeini was charismatic, because he proved that a popular uprising could topple a Western-backed dictator. Every resistance movement in the region studied the Iranian Revolution, learned its tactics, adopted its rhetoric. The hostage crisis gave birth to decades of anti-American militancy. The Iran-Iraq war destabilized the Gulf. The sanctions pushed Iran toward Russia and China. The coup in 1953 created the Iran of 2005, isolated, defiant, nuclear-capable, and deeply hostile to the West. None of that was inevitable. All of it was chosen. Tehran, the Green Movement, millions of Iranians protesting a stolen election, demanding democracy, waving signs in English. Where is my vote? They weren't waving Soviet flags. They weren't burning American effigies. They were asking for the same thing Mossadegh had asked for in 1951, the right to choose their own government. The Western media covered it for 3 weeks, called it the Twitter revolution, then moved on. The Iranian government crushed it. Arrests, beatings, show trials. Why didn't the West support them? Because by 2009, Iran was the enemy. The protesters were irrelevant to oil prices. The sanctions were more useful than solidarity. So the Green Movement died, and a generation of Iranians learnt the same lesson their grandparents learned in 1953. The West talks about democracy, but only when it's profitable. Let's bring it back to the money. Britain was bankrupt in 1951, broke, post-war debt crushing the economy, pound collapsing, empire dissolving. Iranian oil was the last major asset generating hard currency. 16 million barrels a year, profits flowing to London. Mossadegh's nationalisation wasn't just a loss of oil, it was an existential threat to Britain's economic survival. So, they staged a coup, not because they were evil, because they were desperate. But desperation doesn't justify theft, and theft doesn't stop being theft just because you got away with it. Iran's GDP, $400 billion, should be twice that without sanctions. Britain's GDP, $3.5 trillion, built partially on 70 years of oil profits that started in Iran. BP's total historical profit from Iranian operations, 1913 to 1970, estimated at over $150 billion in today's money. Amount paid in reparations or compensation to Iran, 0. Britain still hasn't apologized. America took 60 years to admit what happened. And Iran, still pumping oil, still refusing to forget. Here's the final irony. In 2015, Iran signed the nuclear deal, agreed to limits on uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, opened the door to reconciliation. For 2 years, it worked. Iranian oil started flowing to Europe again. Western companies started negotiations. Tourism increased. Then, 2018, President Trump tore up the deal, reimposed sanctions, called Iran the greatest threat to global peace. Iran's response: restart the nuclear program, enrich uranium to near weapons grade levels, build advanced centrifuges. Why? Because every time Iran tries to play by the rules change. Every time they negotiate in good faith, the deal gets broken. Every time they try to rejoin the international community, someone reminds them, you're not allowed to control your own destiny. The coup never really ended. It just became policy. Mossadegh died in 1967. House arrest. Forgotten. Erased. But his grave became a pilgrimage site after the revolution. Thousands visit every year. They leave flowers. They leave notes. They leave prayers. One note, photographed in 2022, said this: they stole our oil. We got it back. They stole our democracy. We're still waiting. Here's what Britain got: 70 years of oil profits, a global energy company, and a playbook for regime change. Here's what Iran got: 70 years of dictatorship, war, sanctions, isolation, and a revolution that turned the country into an international pariah. Here's what the world got: proof that democracies die when they threaten corporate profits. Proof that coups have half-lives measured in generations. Proof that oil is always worth more than people. The oil still flows. 3 million barrels a day. Iran sells it to China now, to India, to whoever will ignore American sanctions. The money goes to the government. Some of it goes to schools and hospitals. Some of it goes to missiles and militias. None of it goes to Britain. But the legacy of the theft, that's permanent. Because when you stage a coup, you don't just change a government. You change what people believe about justice. You teach them that power matters more than law, that might makes right, that contracts mean nothing if you lack the guns to enforce them. You teach them that democracy is a luxury the empire grants and revokes at will. A young Iranian woman sits in a cafe in Tehran, 23 years old, studying engineering, never lived under the Shah, doesn't remember the revolution. But she knows the story. Every Iranian knows the story. Mossadegh, the coup, the oil, the hostages, the sanctions. It's not ancient history. It's the explanation for why her currency is worthless, why she can't travel freely, why her government is hostile to the West, why the West is hostile back. She didn't choose this. Neither did her parents or her grandparents. But they're all living with the consequences of a decision made in a London office in 1953. A decision to send warships instead of negotiators, to fund a coup instead of accept a democratic outcome, to choose oil over sovereignty. That decision is still killing people, still isolating nations, still proving that the empire never really ended. It just privatized. Final tally, oil stolen, incalculable, still being pumped, still being sold, still fueling the world. Money stolen, at least $200 billion, adjusted for inflation and lost growth. Lives stolen, hundreds of thousands. Coup victims, war casualties, sanctions, deaths. Futures stolen, 2 generations of Iranians who could have grown up in a democracy. Apologies issued, 0. Reparations paid, 0. Lessons learned, apparently none. Because here's the thing about theft. You can get away with it for decades, for generations. But the stolen goods still exist somewhere, and the people you stole from, they remember. They teach their children. Their children teach their children. Memory becomes identity. Grievance becomes culture. History becomes destiny. And 70 years later, when diplomats in Geneva or Vienna ask, why is Iran so hostile? The answer is simple. Because in 1953, you taught them that the West only respects power, so they built power, and now you're shocked they won't bow. The oil still flows, the refineries still burn, the tankers still sail, and somewhere in Tehran, a grandmother tells her granddaughter about a prime minister named Mossadegh who tried to take back what belonged to Iran, who almost succeeded, who got destroyed for trying. The girl asks, did we ever get it back? The grandmother says, we got the oil back, but we never got the future back. That's the real theft, not the barrels, the possibilities.